Hey there, fellow exiles. Welcome back to another video. It's Void241, and today I'm bringing you my first build of the league. Now, I started with Hexblast Mines and I moved into this build eventually. I actually initially started Palstron's Hexblast Mines and it went incredibly well, and I transitioned that into Captain Lance's Lifestacking variant, and that also went very smoothly. And now this is my first build of the league where I have actually made my own build. Now, before we get into the build portion of the video, I do want to say that this league is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to be more experimental. I'll be focusing more on different interactions and a little less on details and making the best build possible. It's going to be more of a showcase format and not necessarily a guide format. Now, that out of the way, I would rate this build at maybe a 7 or an 8 out of 10. Purely because of the cost efficiency. In terms of performance, for me specifically, this performs at what I would consider a 9 out of 10. Real quick, I would like to say, please leave a like and subscribe down below if you end up enjoying my content. I am a new content creator and any support you show really helps me out. Additionally, you can watch me. I stream during the weekdays on Twitch at twitch.tv/void241. I should have a schedule up sometime next week, so please do look out for that. I would love to meet some of you on stream. What is Stormbrand? Now, Stormbrand is a skill that basically drops a brand every single time you cast. These brands go and they attach to different enemies, and when they're attached, they zap them with lightning bolts every time they activate. You can kind of place them and move around. They end up actually being really nice against any sort of bosses or single target opponents because you can kind of place them and now you have an opportunity to move around and dodge. With the basics of Stormbrand out of the way, let's get into the different ways you can scale it. Now, number one, you can have maximum brands. Now, there's actually two types of maximum brands you can have. One comes from the Runebinder keystone, which gives you +1 additional brand attached to an enemy. And the other is you could get it from either brand equity or the brand mastery, which gives you the ability to cast 2 additional brands. Now, there is quite a difference between these two, so pay attention. Runebinder essentially makes it so that if you're in a single target scenario, instead of only one of your brands attaching and dealing damage, you can instead have 2 brands attached to that target to deal damage. Obviously, a significant single target boost because now instead of 1 brand, you have 2. Casting additional brands is slightly different. What this basically does is it increases your maximum total brand count. So for example, even if I can only attach 1 to a single target, I can still have a total of 3 brands out by default. In this case, if I get the +2 brand mastery like I am for this build, I can instead have 5 brands out at once. While I am still restricted to 2 on a single target because of Runebinder, having 5 out at once improves the clear quite significantly and makes the build a lot better to play. In terms of clear, brands do have a different mastery called brands attached to a new enemy every time they activate. Basically what this does is it turns your brands from things that attach to a single enemy and zap them till they're dead into where they kind of just hop between different enemies over and over and over. I personally did not find a need for this because I incorporated a flask swap where I use Oriat's End for mapping and Bottled Faith for single target. So when I'm using Oriat's End, with the explosions, I never really felt the need to have reattach. However, if you have less damage than me, or maybe you don't have an explodey flask, having the reattach mastery definitely helps with your clear, so you should try that out. The final thing I would like to talk about in terms of brands is Remarkable as well as having grand design. Now, Remarkable basically makes it so that we have a 35% chance to create an additional brand every time we create a brand. Just doubles the amount of brands we throw out every time we cast with 3 of these notables. Definitely makes the build feel a lot better to play. We're also using grand design on the same medium clusters. The reason for grand design is because it gives more brand duration and attachment range, which significantly improves how the build feels overall. It's also very important for us to scale a little bit of brand duration at the very least, because we are using Swift brand support. Swift brand support is a huge damage multiplier, and it also makes the build feel a lot better to play in terms of clear, because your brands activate much more frequently. The downside is that your brands last less than half as long, so it does make quite the significant difference to your brand duration. So scaling a little bit more brand duration does make that big difference when it comes to clear, as well as how many times you have to replace your brands on a single target. I've decided to go life stacking and of course Spellblade with Battlemage. I love life stacking. I tried it for the first time with Captain Lance's Hex Blast, and the Dissolution and Wrathpith combo is just so cool, and I just really wanted to make another build with it. The downside of Wrathpith, which is sacrificing your life, no longer matters, because Dissolution makes it so that your actual life pool doesn't really matter. All the damage you take is instead reserved on your life. Now, one thing I would like to mention is that Captain Lance could take Pain Attunement for free, because Detonate Mines activates over and over, and also throwing mines basically means that you're sacrificing so much of your life that you get down to low life very fast. I instead have to reserve my life and use Petrified Blood to actually get down to low life. This isn't actually a downside, since the damage reduction from Petrified Blood still applies. However, there is a different downside. For this build specifically, because we normally only die to reserving life, and our life pool doesn't really have any recovery outside of recharge, which I'll get to in just a moment, what it means is the damage over time from Petrified Blood doesn't get reserved. It actually hits your life pool, which means it can still kill you even if you don't reserve down to 0. So to combat this, I'm getting recoup. I have a T1 recoup roll on my ring, as well as some recoup on the tree. And the recoup essentially just has to be higher than the damage over time you're taking from Petrified Blood. This damage over time comes out to about 30% of the damage I'm taking. I went for extra recoup just to be safe, so I currently have 38% recoup. You could go for more, maybe. You could also potentially go for less. I just decided to play it safe. This setup worked, so I didn't want to mess with it too much. I am also using Eternal Youth for life recovery. The reason is that we are using Blood Magic. Now, Blood Magic makes us have no mana, but basically converts all of the mana costs and reservations into life reservations. The reason this is so nice is because it makes us not have to deal with mana costs at all. It also comes with the upside of having 10% more maximum life. So, as you can see, I could cast everything using my life, even though I have 0 mana. That's perfectly fine. It's also giving me a nice little life buffer. Additionally, you can actually use something really cool, which is that if you link Zealotry to Eternal Blessing normally disables your other auras, but one specific key wording on this is it disables auras that reserve mana. Auras no longer reserve mana, they reserve life. So even while using Eternal Blessing to make Zealotry have no reservation cost, I can still use Petrified Blood, Precision, and Vitality perfectly fine and still reserve my life. You have a free aura, which is super duper nice for the build. The final keystone that I want to talk about is of course a little bit more in depth on Eternal Youth. It does give us a less life regeneration rate and less recovery from leech. Now, while these do not directly matter, less life regeneration rate does come into the last portion of life stacking, which is that we are using Calm Spirit for life regen to convert into rage regen. The reason for this is because by having a large amount of life, it also translates to a small amount of percent regen being a large amount of flat regen. So we can actually generate pretty decent amounts of rage. At the moment, I'm currently regenning 5 rage per second, which in combination with the Berserk reduced rage loss per second enchant means my Berserk actually lasts for a pretty decent amount of time, even with a very low amount of rage regen. Now, that being said, if you do want some more rage regen, I believe, according to POB at the very least, getting Hearty will almost double your rage regen. So this is definitely an option. You can maybe drop some life nodes or some of your cluster nodes. So it will be at the cost of damage. For a little bit more Berserk uptime, I didn't really feel the need for it, but that's definitely an option you can go for if you want to. Now, that's about it for life scaling. So let's get into the Battlemage scaling. So for this build, I am, of course, using Spellblade as well as Battlemage for my damage scaling because, well, you can get a ton of flat damage, and I've always wanted to do Battlemage, but I've kind of been a little bit too scared. Also, this build provides a unique opportunity to actually drop an Ascendancy node on the Inquisitor. That node is Pious Path. Because Dissolution disables our energy shield, we can actually alleviate the need for Pious Path completely, because the linger effect can actually be gained from something like Rational Doctrine. And the reason for this is that Rational Doctrine makes Consecrated Ground as well as Profane Ground linger, even if we're only using it to get the Profane Ground. The linger ability is actually global and it applies to both Conk Ground and Profane Ground regardless of your attributes. So this acts as a replacement for Pious Path. By dropping Pious Path, we can instead go Battlemage, which is how I am making my flat damage function. For this build specifically, I am using essentially a stat stick. All this is here to do is give us a ton of flat damage and a ton of crit multi, and that's it. That's about it in terms of Battlemage as well as life scaling. That's how I'm scaling the damage on this build. Now, there are a couple of other things. For example, I do have level 25 Stormbrand, 3 of those levels coming from the amulet as well as the tattoo for +1 int gems, and one of them coming from my helmet. Speaking of the helmet, this is a very standard Stormbrand helmet. Stormbrand scales very well with cast speed, so I've decided to go for 2 12 passive cluster jewels. Now the energy shield on one of them is kind of wasted, and I do have a very low life roll on the other one. What this does is, with the 35% effect, each of these small nodes gives me 13% spell damage, 4% cast speed, and 5% LE res. Same goes for these, however they also give 4 maximum life. So overall, having 2 12 passives is a very, very significant boost to cast speed, which is a very nice way of scaling the damage of this build. Now, for some side tech that I used in this build before we wrap things up is going to be my Elegant Hubris and Impossible Escape combo. So this combo was actually pretty cheap. I managed to find it pretty easy, and I'm currently using it for ailment immunity. Now there are other ways to get ailment immunity. I'll detail those in just a second, but essentially what this combo is since we're running a Caspero Elegant Hubris so that we can dump tattoos all over our tree, Elegant Hubris also transforms all the notables in this radius. So by getting an Impossible Escape, we can essentially get really useful notables and then allocate them with Impossible Escape. So in this case, I actually have 40% crit multi on both of these nodes, and I have 80% increased spell damage. So this is definitely an upside that you should look out for, maybe even on other builds. I have an 80% chance to avoid being shocked. This is actually how I am becoming ailment immune. I have an 80% chance to avoid being shocked here. I have a 20%, or rather 32% on my Hypnotic Eye Jewel, and then the remaining comes from a Storm Shroud, which converts all the shock avoidance, which is 100% shock avoidance, into avoidance for all elemental ailments. So that makes us immune to shock, chill, sap, scorch, brittle, freeze, and ignite, which is definitely the latter of which being probably the most important for this build. Now the reason that's so important is because any sort of damage over time can kill this build. So we are currently also using boots for cannot be poisoned, as well as chance to avoid bleeding at 100%, and I also have corrupted blood immunity on my Hypnotic Eye Jewel, which brings us at a 100% chance to avoid all ailments, bleed, poison, and corrupted blood. Very, very important, because it's a dissolution build. Damage over time reserves your life, stops you from actually recovering your reserved life, and definitely don't play the build without these things. It's very important. Now, assuming you can't get an Elegant Hubris with the Shock Avoid, what I would instead do is I would fracture the Cannot Be Poisoned on the boots, since it is an Essence mod. You fracture the Cannot Be Poisoned, and then you can roll with Torment Essences until you get T1 life instead. Torment Essences would give you the 60% chance to avoid being shocked on the boots, and then you replace the action speed implicit with 40% chance to avoid being shocked. Now, that might sound like a huge downside, losing the action speed. However, action speed for this build does not actually improve your damage. It only improves the cast rate of your brands as well as your movement speed. It doesn't improve much else. So while it is huge quality of life, it's not actually a direct DPS increase, so it wouldn't be completely terrible to have the avoid shock on the implicit. I would just highly recommend trying to find an Elegant Hubris on with shock avoidance, just so that you can still have that action speed for the additional move speed, and you can get a chaos roll on your boots. Even in the current state of the build, I don't have much chaos res, so that small thing can be pretty important. Finally, I would also like to mention the Patheon. The Patheon, you have to use the Burning Ground Immune Pantheon. Same reason I mentioned earlier as far as dissolution and damage over time is concerned. Always run Soul of Aberath. This is 100% necessary. Make sure to upgrade it. I'm also running Soul of Arakali for the same reason. take reduced damage from damage over time. Additionally, having the chaos resistance against damage over time is nice against things like desecrated ground. Once again, because I don't have much chaos res when my amethyst flask is down. I would like to explain one more thing before we wrap it up, because I unfortunately forgot, which is my ring swap. So I am currently swapping my coral ring out for Call of the Brotherhood when I am farming Sanctum, just to make my freezes a little more reliable. Now this is a net damage loss. It actually loses you a significant amount of damage and HP. However, having the more consistent freeze is super nice. That about wraps it up for the video. I don't think there's much else to cover. Thank you for watching. Again, leave a like down below if you enjoyed the video, and consider subscribing. It would really help out my channel. Since I am growing, since it is a new channel, I would really appreciate it. Do leave a comment down below if you have any questions, or if you just want to mention how your league's been going. I do read all of the comments, even though I might not reply to all of them. And yeah, I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. Stay safe, Exiles.